There's been so many theories out there about what happened to Nancy. And it's interesting with Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, in his last interview he did, he said that they even have a theory that they've had for a while, but he wouldn't say what it was. There was some reporting weeks ago that the Sheriff's Department theory, the working theory, may have been a burglary gone wrong.
We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the reported disappearance of a woman identified as Nancy Guthrie. And in a development that has shifted the direction of this case entirely, the last person known to have seen her alive has now been formally sentenced in connection to her death. If you'd like to follow this case as it unfolds, you can subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll be notified as new details are released. For weeks, the case had been defined by uncertainty. There were no immediate signs of violence, no clear motive, and very few witnesses. But now, with new findings presented in court, investigators say the sequence of events has taken on a very different structure. It begins on an ordinary afternoon. Nancy Guthrie was, by most accounts, a quiet and consistent presence in her community. She lived alone in a modest home on the edge of a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where routines tend to go unnoticed because they rarely change. She was known to keep to herself, but not in a way that raised concern. Neighbors described her as polite, reserved, and predictable in her daily movements. Every morning, she would step outside around the same time, collect her mail, and tend to a small garden near her front porch. In the evenings, a light could usually be seen from her living room window, often remaining on well past sunset. According to investigators, it was this predictable pattern that made the first disruption stand out. On a Tuesday evening, one of her neighbors reportedly noticed something unusual. The porch light, which Nancy typically turned on before dusk, had not been switched on. At first, it didn't seem significant, but by the following morning, there was still no sign of activity. That's when things began to change. A routine welfare check was requested later that day. Officers arrived at the property and found no immediate signs of forced entry. The front door was locked. Windows were intact. Inside, the home appeared undisturbed. Personal belongings were in place. Her phone, however, was not found. According to investigators, the absence of the phone would later become a critical detail. At that stage, the case was still being treated as a missing person investigation. There was no clear indication of foul play. But as officers began reconstructing Nancy's final known movements, a timeline started to form. And within that timeline, one name appeared consistently. A man identified in court documents as Daniel Reeves. Reeves was not a stranger to Nancy. In fact, the two had been seen together on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. He lived several blocks away and, according to reports, had been assisting Nancy with minor repairs around her home. Neighbors recalled seeing his vehicle parked outside her house at irregular hours. At the time, it didn't raise concern. But in retrospect, investigators say these sightings became significant. According to phone records, Nancy and Reeves exchanged several calls and messages on the day she was last seen. The final confirmed contact occurred in the late afternoon. After that, her phone activity stopped completely. That's where investigators focused their attention. Reeves was interviewed early in the investigation. He told officers that he had visited Nancy that day, but left before evening. He stated that their interaction was brief and uneventful. According to him, there was no indication that anything was wrong. At first, his account appeared to align with the known timeline, but this is where investigators noticed something unusual. Surveillance footage from a nearby street camera captured a vehicle matching Reeves' car entering Nancy's street that afternoon. That alone was not unexpected. However, what stood out was the lack of footage showing the vehicle leaving. Investigators reviewed hours of recordings. The vehicle was seen arriving, but there was no clear record of its departure. When questioned about this discrepancy, Reeves reportedly stated that he may have taken a different route out of the area. The exact details, however, remained unclear. At this point, the case began to shift. A search warrant was issued for Reeves's vehicle. According to investigators, what they found inside introduced the first major anomaly in the case. Traces of what appeared to be blood were detected in the trunk area. The amount was small, but enough to warrant further testing. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the blood matched Nancy Guthrie. That discovery changed the structure of the investigation. What had initially been treated as a missing person case was now being approached as a potential homicide. The timeline was revisited. Every movement, every interaction, every gap in the sequence was examined in greater detail. Investigators returned to Nancy's home, this time looking for signs that may have been overlooked. According to reports, they identified subtle inconsistencies, a chair slightly out of place, a rug that appeared to have been recently moved. These were not obvious indicators, but within the context of the new findings, they carried weight. Reeves was brought in for a second interview. During this session, investigators presented the forensic evidence. According to court records, his responses became less consistent. Certain details of his earlier statement did not align with the physical evidence. However, he did not admit to any wrongdoing. At the same time, digital analysts were working to reconstruct Nancy's final communications. While her phone had not been recovered, data from service providers revealed the timing of her last signals. The final ping placed her device within close proximity to her home. After that, there was nothing, no movement, no activity, no connection. And that's when investigators began to consider a different possibility. If Nancy had not left her home voluntarily, and if her last confirmed interaction was with Reeves, then the sequence of events may have been far more contained than initially believed. A focused search was conducted in areas surrounding both properties. Days later, investigators reported the discovery of a location of interest. The exact details of that location were not immediately released, but according to official statements, evidence recovered there would play a central role in the case moving forward. And as the timeline continued to take shape, one question became increasingly difficult to ignore. If Daniel Reeves was indeed the last person to see Nancy Guthrie, what happened in the hours that followed his visit? That answer, investigators would later suggest, was already beginning to reveal itself. As the investigation moved forward, attention shifted to the location investigators had identified during the expanded search. The area was described in official reports as being within a short driving distance from both Nancy Guthrie's home and the residence of Daniel Reeves. It was not a place that would typically draw attention, quiet, partially concealed, and rarely visited except by those familiar with the surroundings. According to investigators, the search of that location was methodical. Teams worked in a structured pattern, documenting each step and preserving the sequence of discovery. It did not take long before they found what they were looking for. Human remains were recovered. The confirmation process required time. Forensic specialists conducted examinations to determine identity, cause of death, and any trace evidence that could help reconstruct what had happened. While the exact details were not released immediately, authorities later confirmed that the remains were those of Nancy Guthrie. At that point, the case formally transitioned from a missing person investigation to a homicide, and that's where the timeline began to narrow. According to the medical examiner's report, the condition of the remains made it difficult to establish a precise time of death. However, certain indicators allowed investigators to place it within a general window, one that aligned closely with the afternoon and evening of the day Nancy was last seen. That alignment carried weight. It meant that the final confirmed interaction between Nancy and Daniel Reeves was no longer just a point of interest. It was now central to the structure of the case. Investigators returned to Reeves' statements, reviewing them against the physical evidence. In his initial interview, he had maintained that he left Nancy's home without incident. He described a brief visit, routine in nature, with no conflict or unusual behavior. But as the evidence developed, inconsistencies began to surface. According to investigators, data extracted from Reeves's phone provided a more detailed look at his movements. Location records indicated that his device remained in the vicinity of Nancy's home longer than he had originally stated. The difference was not extreme, but it was enough to raise questions. More importantly, there was a gap. After leaving the area, his phone appeared to go inactive for a period of time. When it reconnected to the network, it did so near the location where Nancy's remains were later found. Reeves was asked to explain this sequence. According to court testimony, his response was unclear. He suggested that he may have been driving through the area, but could not provide a specific reason for being there. Investigators noted that his explanation lacked detail and did not align cleanly with the data. At the same time, forensic evidence continued to build. The traces of blood found in the trunk of Reeves's vehicle were analyzed further. In addition to confirming that the blood matched Nancy, specialists identified patterns that suggested transfer rather than accidental contact. The positioning and distribution were consistent with movement, something being placed or shifted within the trunk space. That detail became significant. Investigators also examined fibers and soil samples recovered from both the vehicle and the location where the remains were found. According to reports, there were similarities between the materials. While not definitive on their own, these connections added another layer to the developing sequence. And that's where the case began to solidify. Reeves was taken into custody. During questioning, he continued to deny involvement in Nancy's death. However, prosecutors would later argue that the cumulative evidence told a different story, one built on timeline reconstruction, physical findings, and inconsistencies in his account. The case proceeded to trial. In court, the prosecution focused on structure. They presented the sequence of events step by step, beginning with Nancy's routine, moving through her final known interactions, and ending with the discovery of her remains. Each element was tied back to Reeves, his presence, his movements, and the evidence linked to him. According to courtroom observers, the presentation was deliberate and measured. Phone records were displayed, showing the pattern of communication between Nancy and Reeves. Surveillance footage was introduced, highlighting the arrival of his vehicle and the absence of a clearly recorded departure. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence and the analysis conducted within the vehicle. The defense, meanwhile, challenged the interpretation of that evidence. They argued that the timeline was not as precise as it appeared. They pointed out that the lack of direct witnesses left room for alternative explanations. They questioned whether the forensic findings could definitively place Nancy inside Reeves's vehicle under the circumstances described by the prosecution. They also emphasized that Reeves had no documented history of violence. For a time, the outcome remained uncertain, but this is where investigators, and ultimately the jury, focused on one specific detail: the gap in the timeline. It was not just the presence of Reeves's phone near the location where Nancy's remains were found. It was the absence of any clear explanation for why he was there, combined with the period of inactivity that coincided with the estimated time frame of the crime. According to prosecutors, that gap represented more than missing information. It represented an attempt to obscure movement. As the trial continued, additional testimony reinforced that interpretation. Analysts explained how device inactivity can occur when a phone is powered off or placed in a location where it cannot connect to a network. While not conclusive on its own in the context of the broader evidence, it became part of the overall structure presented to the jury. And that's where the case began to shift again. After deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Daniel Reeves was found guilty in connection with the murder of Nancy Guthrie. In the sentencing phase, the court considered the nature of the evidence, the sequence of events, and the lack of a clear alternative explanation. Reeves was subsequently sentenced, bringing a formal conclusion to the legal proceedings. But even with that conclusion, certain questions remained. According to investigators, the exact sequence of events inside Nancy's home was never fully reconstructed. There were no direct witnesses, no recording, no single moment that could be identified as the point where everything changed. Instead, the case was built on fragments, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern. And that pattern led to a conviction. Still, as the investigation closed, one detail continued to draw attention. The condition of the scene inside Nancy's home suggested that whatever happened may have occurred quickly, and without the kind of disturbance typically associated with a violent event. And that raises a question investigators have acknowledged, but never fully answered. What exactly happened in those final moments before the timeline went silent? In the days following the sentencing, the case of Nancy Guthrie entered a different phase. The legal process had reached a conclusion, but for investigators, the work of understanding the full sequence of events did not end there. Cases built on reconstruction often leave behind unanswered details, and in this instance, several aspects of the timeline remained unclear. According to investigators, one of the most difficult elements to fully establish was what occurred inside Nancy's home during the final moments before her disappearance. There were no signs of forced entry, No indication of a struggle that would typically be expected in a violent encounter. Furniture was largely undisturbed. Items remained in place. This suggested a specific kind of interaction. Investigators considered the possibility that Nancy may have known and trusted the person responsible. That idea aligned with the established timeline, her final confirmed contact being with Daniel Reeves, someone who had been inside her home on prior occasions. But even with that context, the absence of clear disruption raised further questions. According to forensic specialists, certain forms of violence can occur without leaving obvious signs at the scene, particularly if the incident is brief or controlled. However, without direct evidence from inside the home, the exact sequence could not be definitively mapped, and that's where the case continues to leave room for interpretation. Another area that drew attention was the handling of Nancy's phone. As previously noted, the device was never recovered. Data records showed its final activity near her home, but after that, there was no trace. Investigators explored multiple possibilities. The phone may have been intentionally discarded, destroyed, or left in a location where it could not reconnect to a network. Without the device itself, those possibilities could not be confirmed. Still, its absence was considered significant. In many cases, a phone can provide a detailed record of movement, communication, and timing. In this instance, that record stopped abruptly, and according to investigators, that abrupt ending aligned closely with the narrow window in which they believe the crime occurred. The location where Nancy's remains were found also continued to be a point of focus. It was not an area she was known to visit. There were no personal connections linking her to that place. However, investigators noted that it was accessible by vehicle and could be reached within a relatively short time from her home. That detail fit within the broader structure of the timeline. According to the prosecution's case, Nancy was transported from her home to that location. The evidence supporting that conclusion was indirect but consistent. Blood traces in Reeves's vehicle, soil and fiber similarities, and the presence of his phone in the vicinity during the relevant time frame. Taken together, those elements form the basis of the argument presented in court. But even with a conviction secured, investigators acknowledge that the case relied on a sequence of probabilities rather than a single definitive moment of proof. And that distinction is important. It reflects the reality of many investigations where the full picture is assembled piece by piece, rather than captured in a single clear event. For Nancy Guthrie, that means certain questions may never be fully answered. What was said during that final interaction? Was there a specific event that triggered the outcome? Or did the situation develop in a way that could not have been anticipated? According to official statements, those details remain unknown. What is known is the structure of the case as it was presented and ultimately accepted in court. A timeline built from communication records, physical evidence, and movement patterns. A sequence that placed Daniel Reeves at the center of Nancy's final hours. And a series of findings that, when viewed together, led to a conclusion beyond reasonable doubt in the eyes of the jury. In the community where Nancy lived, the impact of the case has been lasting. Neighbors who once described routine and predictability now speak more cautiously about what can be seen and what cannot. The idea that a familiar presence could be connected to such an outcome has changed how some view their surroundings. For those closest to Nancy, the conclusion of the trial brings a measure of resolution, but not necessarily closure. That distinction remains, because while the legal process can determine responsibility, it does not always provide a complete understanding of why events unfolded the way they did. And in this case, the why remains only partially answered. As investigators closed their files, they did so with the recognition that the case had reached its formal end, but that its unanswered elements would likely continue to be discussed. For those who followed the investigation from the beginning, the sequence is now clear. A routine life, a single disruption, a timeline that narrowed, and a final series of findings that changed everything. If you've been following this case, you already understand how much of it depended on small details that at first may not have seemed significant. But over time, those details formed a pattern, and in the end, it was that pattern that led to the outcome now recorded in court.